Welcome to the Sleepy Christian, where faith meets rest and stillness becomes sacred. Tonight, we journey through mystery, wonder, and ancient truth. Softly, gently, like a whisper in the desert wind. What if the burning bush never stops speaking? What if God still calls out in quiet places when we least expect it, and when we are most tired, afraid, or lost? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Leave a comment below. Whether you're in a busy city or a quiet countryside, you're part of this gentle circle of peace. Now, close your eyes and let the Spirit speak softly to your soul. In the quiet of the desert, long before Moses became a leader, long before plagues or parted seas or tablets of stone, there was only sand, silence, and a flicker of something strange. A bush on fire. Not an unusual sight in the dry wilderness. But this one was different. It burned and burned, and yet was not consumed. Moses turned aside to look at it. And that simple moment, the act of turning, of noticing, became the doorway to a divine encounter. How often do we walk past the flickering signs in our own lives because we're too distracted to notice, too busy, too tired, too discouraged to believe that something holy could be calling us right now, in the middle of our ordinary routines? But the flame still burns. Not in the same way, perhaps. Not as a bush in the desert, but maybe as a moment that catches your attention for no reason. A person you didn't expect to meet. A verse you've read 1,000 times but suddenly feels alive. A dream you can't shake. A moment of peace you didn't earn. A silence that feels like it's watching you. Maybe those are the new burning bushes of today. The fire did not consume the bush. It illuminated it. It transformed it into a vessel of wonder. That's what God's voice does. It does not destroy. It awakens. It stirs the sleeping parts of us, the ones we buried beneath schedules and sorrow and survival. It says, "Come closer." And yet, God didn't speak until Moses turned aside to look. That's something to think about. It was the act of attention, of wonder, that opened the conversation. Could it be that heaven is waiting on our curiosity? That God often speaks after we notice, not before? There is power in the pause. There is revelation in reverence. We live in a world filled with noise, screens, deadlines, anxieties, endless opinions. But the fire does not shout. It doesn't demand your attention like the chaos of social media or the urgency of your to-do list. No, the fire waits. It burns with quiet persistence, waiting for someone, maybe you, to turn aside, to look, to listen. And when you do, the ordinary becomes holy. Your living room becomes a sanctuary. Your breath becomes a prayer. The silence becomes filled with presence. The burning bush still speaks. It says, "I see you." It says, "You are not forgotten." It says, "Take off your sandals, for this moment is sacred." It says, "You are standing on holy ground, not because the world around you changed, but because you finally noticed." This is the miracle of God's flame. It doesn't just shine on the outside, it burns inside us. We are not called to be consumed by stress or fear or regret. We are called to be kindling for something brighter, something eternal. So tonight, or tomorrow morning, or whenever your soul is still enough to hear, remember the fire. It may be flickering quietly through the cracks of your ordinary day. It may be calling your name, gently, patiently, waiting for you to turn aside and see. And once you do, nothing will ever be the same. Moses wasn't ready. When God called him from the burning bush, Moses didn't respond with courage or confidence. He responded with fear, confusion, resistance. "Who am I?" he asked. "That I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" That single question, "Who am I?" echoes across centuries, doesn't it? It's the question we all ask when God places something heavy and holy in front of us. We feel small, inadequate, broken. We list all the reasons why we're not enough. Too young, too old, too sinful, too scared, too unsure of ourselves. But here's the quiet beauty of this story. God never argues with Moses about his worth. He doesn't try to boost his confidence or stroke his ego. God simply answers, "I will be with you." Moses wasn't chosen because he was ready. He was chosen because he was willing to turn aside and listen. He was chosen because he showed up, even if trembling, even if uncertain. Isn't that comforting? You don't have to be fearless to be called. You don't have to be strong to be chosen. You just have to be honest enough to say, "I'm not ready," and humble enough to listen anyway. Moses had every reason to feel inadequate. He had a past. He was a fugitive. He had killed a man in Egypt and run away. For 40 years he lived in the wilderness, watching sheep that didn't belong to him, in a land that wasn't his home. And maybe that's how you feel too, lost in a season that feels like exile, far away from the dreams you once had, disconnected from your purpose, wondering if your life is just passing time. But even in that wilderness, God was preparing Moses. The long days in solitude, the quiet with the sheep, the vast silence of the desert, it wasn't wasted. It was training, not for war, but for listening, for leading, for patience, for courage. You see, God doesn't rush the people he calls. He shapes them in the dark, in obscurity, in silence. Moses wasn't ready by the world's standards, but he was exactly where he needed to be to hear the voice of God. So if you've ever felt like your life is on pause, if you've ever thought you missed your chance, remember Moses. Remember that God calls people when they least expect it, and especially when they feel unworthy. When Moses doubted himself, God didn't give him a motivational speech. He gave him presence. "I will be with you," God said. And in the end, that's what makes anyone truly ready. Not their resume, not their reputation, but their relationship with the one who calls them. Still, Moses kept resisting. "What if they don't believe me? I'm not a good speaker. Please, Lord, send someone else." Can you feel the weight of his anxiety, the hesitation, the desperate desire to be left alone? And yet, God didn't give up on him. That's important to understand. God isn't looking for perfect obedience on the first try. He works with us, walks with us, waits with us. He listens to our fears and meets us in them, not with judgment, but with reassurance. He even sends help. When Moses insisted he couldn't speak well, God didn't abandon him. He gave him Aaron, a voice to stand beside him. Maybe you feel like you're not enough. That's okay. Maybe you've told God no more than once. That's okay too. God's calling doesn't vanish because of your fear. It lingers, it waits, it finds new ways to reach you. And maybe, just maybe, it's finding you now. In this quiet moment, in the stillness where all your fears rise to the surface, in your own personal wilderness, where no one sees how tired you are, how unsure you feel, how distant you believe you've become. But God sees. He knows you're not ready, and He's not asking for that. He's just asking for a heart that will turn aside and listen. A soul that's willing to say, "Here I am," even if it's whispered through trembling lips. Because in the end, readiness isn't about self-confidence, it's about God's presence. And that is more than enough. "Take off your sandals," said the voice from the burning bush, "for the place where you are standing is holy ground." It wasn't a temple. It wasn't a sanctuary built by human hands. It was a patch of wilderness, dry earth scattered with stones and thorns. But in that moment, because God was present, it became sacred. And what was the first command? Not to kneel, not to pray, not even to speak. It was to remove his sandals, to strip away the barrier between himself and the holy ground beneath him. Why? Sandals are practical. They protect us from discomfort, from the heat of the earth, from the jagged rocks and painful thorns. But they also separate us from the direct experience of the ground we walk on. In the same way, we walk through life with emotional and spiritual sandals on, layers of protection we build around ourselves. Cynicism to guard against disappointment, busyness to shield us from our own thoughts, perfectionism to defend against feelings of shame, control to protect ourselves from uncertainty. But when we stand before the sacred, God asks us to take them off, to become vulnerable, to feel, to truly touch what is real beneath us. It's a simple act, but a profound one. Taking off your sandals is a gesture of surrender, humility, and readiness. It says, I know I'm not in control here. It says, I want to be fully present. It says, I trust this ground, even if it feels uncomfortable underfoot. So many of us go through life never realizing how sacred the ground beneath us really is. We wait for special moments, church services, holidays, mountaintop experiences, to feel close to God. But the sacred is not confined to special places. The sacred is wherever you notice it. It could be in the kitchen as you stand washing dishes and feel a sudden, mysterious peace. It could be at your child's bedside as they sleep and something stirs in you. A love too deep for words. It could be during a moment of heartbreak, when you fall to your knees and weep. And somehow, God feels closer than ever. The ground is holy, not because of where it is, but because of who is there. And so often, God is there, right where you are, waiting for you to take off your sandals. But this isn't just about reverence. It's also about intimacy. When you walk barefoot, your posture changes. Your steps become gentler, more deliberate. You become aware of every pebble, every texture, every rise and fall beneath your feet. You slow down. You listen to the earth. That's how God wants us to move through our lives, not in a hurry, not hardened by layers of protection, but gently, with open hearts and sensitive souls. Imagine what would happen if we approached our ordinary days that way. If we took off our sandals in the middle of an argument and asked, "Is this holy ground?" If we took them off before speaking to a loved one and thought, "This person is sacred." If we removed them as we prayed, not just physically, but emotionally, letting down our guard, opening our whole heart. And maybe, most importantly, taking off your sandals means removing what you think makes you worthy. God didn't wait for Moses to clean himself up, to change his clothes, to become better. He just said, "Come as you are, but come barefoot. Come without pretense, without armor, without ego. Come as the one I made you to be, vulnerable, small, and ready." Holy ground isn't always comfortable. It might make you weep. It might make you confront your past. It might stir something in you that you've been avoiding. But it's also where healing happens, where transformation begins. So maybe, in this moment, you feel a strange stirring, something quiet yet undeniable. That could be your own burning bush. That could be God saying, "You don't have to climb a mountain to find me. Just take off your sandals. Let your soul touch the sacred. Let your spirit breathe again. Let yourself be fully present. The ground beneath you, yes, even now, might be holier than you think." "I have surely seen the affliction of my people," said the voice from the flame. "I have heard their cries, and I know their suffering." God sees, God hears, God knows. These words drifted through the burning bush and into Moses' soul like a healing balm. For hundreds of years, the Israelites had suffered in silence, groaning under the weight of slavery in Egypt. Many probably wondered if God had forgotten them, if the promises made to their ancestors had faded into the dust. But in that one moment, everything changed. Not because their suffering ended right away, but because they were no longer invisible. They were no longer alone. And maybe that's what your heart needs to hear tonight. You are seen, you are heard, you are known. In a world where it's so easy to feel overlooked, where our lives are reduced to numbers, likes, followers, performance reviews, it's easy to believe that our pain goes unnoticed, that our struggles are small in the grand scheme of things, that no one really knows how hard it's been just to keep going. But God does. He sees you when no one else does. When you wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding with worry. When you smile in public but collapse in private. When you wonder if your prayers are just echoing back into the silence. He sees it all, not just the outward appearance, but the hidden sorrow, the unspoken longing, the tiredness buried behind your eyes. And he doesn't just see it, he feels it. Scripture tells us that God is near to the brokenhearted, not just aware, not just informed, near. There's something profoundly comforting about that kind of nearness. Because when you know you are seen, not in judgment, but with compassion, it becomes easier to breathe, easier to hope, easier to believe that maybe, just maybe, your story still matters. The world may pass you by, friends may misunderstand, family may fail to notice what you're carrying. But the creator of the universe has his eye on you. Even Moses, standing barefoot before the burning bush, needed to hear that. He too had wounds. He too had questions. Did God see him? A murderer, a wanderer, a man who had run from his past and buried his dreams under years of sheep herding and silence. But God saw Moses, and he sees you. He sees the child you were and the adult you've become. He sees the effort you put into healing, into forgiving, into trying again when you didn't have the strength. He sees the kindness you show when no one is watching. He sees the battles you fight in your mind, the temptations you resist, the tears you never let fall. And because he sees you, you are not abandoned. We often associate God's presence with the spectacular, with thunder on mountaintops, with miracles and signs. But the most intimate kind of seeing doesn't require a spectacle. It requires attention, tenderness, stillness, like a parent watching their child sleep, like a shepherd counting every sheep, even the ones who keep wandering off. To be seen by God is to be known in your fullness, without masks, without pretending. And not just known, but loved in that knowing. Nothing is hidden from him, and still, he chooses you. Sometimes, when we feel most unseen, we also feel unworthy. We convince ourselves that if anyone really knew us, they'd walk away. But God draws closer. He walks into our pain, not away from it. He steps into our Egypt, our chains, our questions, and says, I have seen your affliction, and I have come down. That's the God we meet in the burning bush, not a distant ruler in the sky, but a present Father who gets involved, who steps into our suffering, who refuses to look away. So, what if you stopped hiding? What if you believed, truly believed, that you don't have to earn God's attention, that you already have it? What if you trusted that your tears are counted, your prayers are held, your fears are heard? Tonight, maybe you feel forgotten, but you are not. Maybe you feel like your pain doesn't matter, but it does. Maybe you feel invisible, but God sees, and he knows, and he has not forgotten you. Let that truth settle into your bones. Let it comfort you like a warm blanket around your soul. You are seen, you are heard, you are known. And that, dear soul, is the beginning of healing. The wilderness is not a place most of us choose willingly. It's barren, it's lonely, and it's quiet in ways that can feel uncomfortable. There's no applause there, no clear direction, no certainty, just silence, wind, and waiting. But again and again, throughout Scripture, it is in the wilderness that God speaks. When Moses fled Egypt after killing the Egyptian, he wasn't running toward a destiny. He was escaping his failure. He had tried, in his own strength, to be a deliverer, and it went terribly wrong. He became a fugitive, a man with blood on his hands and regret in his heart. And so he hid, in Midian, in obscurity. There, far from power, far from ambition, he became a shepherd. A quiet job, an unnoticed life. For 40 years, he led sheep through the silence. 40 years of no miracles. 40 years of dust, of monotony. 40 years of waiting. For what, he didn't know. Maybe he thought the story was over. Maybe he assumed his mistakes had disqualified him forever. But God hadn't forgotten. Because the wilderness isn't the end. It's the preparation. It is in the wilderness that God reshapes our vision. He strips away our pride, our expectations, even our desire for recognition. He slows us down until we finally become still enough to hear. And it's in that stillness that the whisper comes. The burning bush didn't appear in Pharaoh's court. It didn't show up in a crowded temple. It waited for Moses in the wild, on the far side of the desert, where no one was looking. And maybe that's true for your life too. Maybe you've been wandering, unsure of where you're going. Maybe you've been in a season that feels dry, lonely, and confusing. You look around and see no path forward, no sign, no miracle, just survival. But the wilderness is not a punishment. It is often a sacred pause, a holy hush. A place where God clears out the noise of the world and teaches you to listen with new ears. Think about this. Moses spent 40 years in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by wealth, education, and influence. And yet, he wasn't ready. But 40 years in the wilderness with nothing but sheep and silence, that's when he finally became the kind of man God could trust with a nation. Because the wilderness does something strange and beautiful to the soul. It humbles you. It quiets your ego. It makes you ask deeper questions. It reveals who you really are, and more importantly, who God really is. In the wilderness, you stop relying on your performance. You learn to live without applause. You start to find comfort in the quiet and recognize the sacred in the small. You discover that God isn't just in the miracles, He's in the mundane, in the wind, in the waiting, in the watching of sheep. Maybe that's what God is doing in your life right now. You might not see a burning bush yet, but maybe He's been calling you long before it catches fire, through the whispers in your loneliness, through the ache in your chest, through the still, small voice that rises up when the world goes quiet. Maybe the job that feels beneath you is shaping your heart. Maybe the silence that feels like abandonment is making room for His voice. Maybe the obscurity that feels like exile is where your calling is being born. Because the truth is, the wilderness doesn't just happen to us, it happens for us. And here's something even more mysterious. God didn't call Moses out of the wilderness. He called him from within it. He didn't say, "Come home and then I'll speak." He said, "Here, in the middle of nowhere, I see you and I am sending you." In other words, your location does not disqualify your calling. Your emptiness doesn't cancel your purpose. Sometimes the most powerful assignments come when you feel least equipped to carry them. And sometimes the call of God comes not to lift you out of the wilderness, but to transform you through it. So if you are in that place now, wondering, waiting, unsure, don't rush to escape it. Don't numb it. Don't curse it. Listen. Listen like Moses did, with sand beneath your feet and wonder in your heart. Because somewhere in that silence, God may be preparing to speak your name. Not to condemn you, not to remind you of your failure, but to tell you that He has seen your heart, that He has not forgotten your dreams, and that the fire still burns. The wilderness may feel empty, but it's not. It's full of God, full of preparation, full of the kind of truth that only reveals itself in silence. So stay a while and listen, because the voice that once spoke from a bush in the middle of nowhere still speaks today. But what if they don't believe me? That was the question Moses asked, almost in desperation. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't rebellious. It was deeply human. He had just heard the voice of God from a burning bush. He had received a sacred assignment to go back to Egypt, confront Pharaoh, and lead an entire nation to freedom. But Moses didn't say yes with boldness or joy. Instead, he asked the question that lives quietly in the hearts of so many of us. What if they don't believe me? What if they laugh? What if they doubt me? What if they reject what I say, what I feel, what I know I experienced? Can you relate to that fear? It's one thing to have a moment of divine clarity when you're alone, when the room is still, when your heart is open, when the Spirit speaks. But stepping out and sharing that encounter, living it out in front of others, that's something else entirely. That takes courage, that exposes us. We fear not just being wrong, we fear being dismissed, mocked, ignored. And sometimes that fear paralyzes us more than failure ever could. Moses knew how the world worked. He had grown up in the palace, but he was also Hebrew. He belonged to both worlds, and neither at the same time. He had tried to help once before, years earlier when he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and it ended in violence, in failure, in exile. He had already experienced what it was like to not be believed, not be accepted. So when God told him to go back, he flinched. He didn't say no outright. He simply raised the question many of us carry silently. What if my voice isn't enough? What if no one listens? And how did God respond? Did he give Moses a guarantee, a detailed success plan, a promise that everything would go smoothly? No. He gave Moses signs. He asked him, "What is that in your hand?" Moses answered, "A staff." It was nothing special, just a piece of wood, something ordinary, something he used every day, a shepherd's tool, a walking stick. And God said, "Throw it on the ground." When Moses obeyed, the staff became a serpent. When he picked it up, it became a staff again. It was a sign, not just for Pharaoh, but for Moses himself. Proof that the ordinary can become extraordinary when placed in the hands of God. But even more than that, God was showing Moses a deeper truth. You already have what you need. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to borrow someone else's gifts. I will use what is already in your hand. Isn't that a powerful comfort? So many times, we feel like we're not enough. We tell ourselves we're not gifted, not educated, not eloquent. We look at others and think, if only I had their talents, their confidence, their platform, then maybe God could use me. But God doesn't need you to be someone else. He just needs you to be available, to open your hand and offer what you have, even if it seems small. God gave Moses more than one sign. He told him to place his hand in his cloak. When he took it out, it was diseased. When he placed it in again, it was healed. A sign of God's power to both afflict and restore. A reminder that the same hand that seems flawed can be used for miracles. Still, Moses hesitated. He said, "But Lord, I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." And again, God didn't argue with Moses about his weaknesses. He simply said, "Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? In other words, you're focusing on the wrong thing. You're focused on your limitations, but I am focused on your calling. You're focused on the words you think you lack, but I am the one who speaks through you. God wasn't surprised by Moses' weakness. He had already accounted for it, and still, he called him. So if you've ever said to yourself, I'm not smart enough, I'm not spiritual enough, I'm not confident enough, I'm not ready, know this: God already knows. He sees the hesitation in your heart. He hears the tremble in your voice. And still, he calls you. And yes, there will always be people who don't believe you. People who question your story, your vision, your faith. Even Jesus, the Son of God, was rejected in his own hometown. Even he was mocked, misunderstood, and betrayed. But the truth of your encounter with God is not invalidated by the doubt of others. You don't have to convince everyone. You don't have to win every argument. You only have to obey. You only have to speak when the fire tells you to speak. Go when the voice tells you to go, and trust that God will meet you in your weakness. God never asked Moses to be fearless. He asked him to be faithful. And he's asking the same from you. So yes, you may ask, but what if they don't believe me? But listen to the deeper question God is asking in return. Do you believe me? Do you trust that I will be with you? Do you trust that I gave you that story, that passion, that voice on purpose? Do you trust that I will go before you and be your strength when you feel small? Because in the end, it's not about your voice. It's about the one who speaks through it. And that, dear soul, is more than enough. God looked at Moses and asked him a simple question. What is that in your hand? Moses, perhaps confused or uncertain of where this was going, replied, a staff, just a stick, a tool, a shepherd's rod. Something so ordinary, so plain, so unremarkable, that it likely seemed almost foolish to even mention. But God saw more, because what Moses considered just a staff was, in God's hands, a sign, a symbol, a sacred instrument. God said, throw it to the ground. And when Moses did, the staff became a serpent. Then God said, pick it up by the tail. And when Moses obeyed, despite the fear, despite how strange and dangerous it seemed, the serpent returned to its former form, a staff. That single act transformed Moses' view of what he held. For years, that staff had simply been a tool for guiding sheep, a walking stick through rough terrain, something to lean on in solitude. It had no power of its own. It had no deeper meaning. It was just part of the daily grind, a quiet companion in the wilderness. But God revealed that even something as humble as a staff, when surrendered, could become a vessel for the miraculous. And so God asks the same of us. What is in your hand? What have you been carrying that you've overlooked or dismissed? What part of your daily life feels too ordinary to matter? Perhaps it's your voice. Perhaps it's a quiet gift for listening, a love for writing, or a deep well of empathy. Perhaps it's your ability to bring peace into tense situations, or your habit of encouraging others behind the scenes. To you, it may seem small, but to God, it may be the very thing He wants to use to bring light into someone else's darkness. Sometimes we spend our lives waiting for something new, a better opportunity, a more visible platform, a more impressive talent, while God is gently pointing to what's already in our hands. That job you think is insignificant, that family role you think no one notices, that creative idea you've kept hidden out of fear, the small acts of love you show when no one's watching, they're not meaningless, they're your staff. And God can use them, if you're willing to let them go. Because the key isn't just what Moses had, it's what he did with it. He laid it down. He released control. He obeyed. even when it didn't make sense. He trusted that the thing he'd always carried, now surrendered, could become something sacred. And from that moment on, the staff was never just a staff again. It became the instrument through which rivers were turned to blood, the Red Sea was parted, water flowed from a rock, and enemies were defeated. It became a symbol of divine power working through human obedience. Not because the staff had power on its own, but because the one who held it believed. And perhaps that's where many of us struggle. Not with what's in our hands, but with whether we believe it's enough, whether we're enough. We underestimate the gifts we've been given. We look at our lives and see ordinary, but God sees potential. God sees purpose. God sees the next step in a plan far bigger than we can imagine. And when we say, "It's just a staff," God says, "Watch what I can do with it." So tonight, in the quiet, think about what you've been carrying. Maybe it's not glamorous. Maybe it doesn't shine. Maybe it's something you've had for so long that you don't even see it anymore. But maybe it's the thing God wants to use, the thing God will breathe upon, the thing that when laid down in surrender will rise again with purpose. And remember, God didn't call Moses because he had a staff. He called him because he had a willing heart. And that heart, combined with obedience, changed history. You don't need more. You don't need someone else's calling. You just need to ask with open hands and open heart, "Lord, what is in my hand? And what would you have me do with it?" Because when the ordinary meets the divine, miracles are never far behind. Moses stood trembling in front of the burning bush, full of questions, full of fear, full of reasons why he wasn't the right man for the task. But in the middle of all his uncertainty, all his excuses, God spoke 7 quiet words that changed everything. "I will be with you." It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a blueprint. It wasn't a detailed strategy or a list of guarantees. It was a promise, a presence, a personal assurance that Moses would not face this calling alone. And that's often how God works. He doesn't always give us every answer. He doesn't always show us how it will all unfold, but he always gives us himself. We crave clarity. God offers companionship. We beg for certainty. God whispers presence. "I will be with you." There's something profoundly comforting and terrifying about that, because it means you won't always know the outcome. You won't always have control, but you will never be alone. When God said those words to Moses, he didn't mean, "I will make everything easy." He didn't say, "You won't be afraid," or "You won't struggle." In fact, Moses would face overwhelming resistance. He would deal with complaints from his own people, threats from Pharaoh, and a burden so heavy he would cry out in desperation more than once. But through all of it, through plagues, deserts, miracles, and mistakes, God was with him, leading, guiding, sustaining, speaking. That's what made the difference. And that's what makes the difference in your life too. Because sometimes you look at the path ahead and it feels too hard, too steep, too uncertain. You feel unqualified, underprepared, overwhelmed. And you say, "God, I can't do this." But he doesn't argue. He doesn't list your strengths. He simply says, "I will be with you." You don't have to be strong enough. You don't have to be ready. You don't even have to be brave all the time. You just have to remember who walks beside you. Think about that. The same God who called Moses is the one who calls you. The same God who split the sea, who rained down manna, who gave water from a rock. That's the God who says to you, "I will be with you." He doesn't change. He doesn't abandon. He doesn't get tired of your doubts, your stumbles, your slow steps. He stays. Even when you question, even when you cry, even when you wander off and think you've blown it, still, he stays. Because His presence isn't conditional on your performance. It's rooted in His love, not your strength. His covenant, not your perfection. Moses would go on to lead an entire nation, not because he had all the answers, but because he had presence, divine presence. And the presence of God was enough to move mountains, silence enemies, and carry an entire people through wilderness after wilderness. And the same is true for you. Whatever you're facing, wherever God is calling you, into a new chapter, a new challenge, a deeper level of faith, the most important thing isn't what you bring to the table. It's that He comes with you. There will be days you doubt your calling. There will be nights when the fear feels louder than the fire. There will be moments when you wonder if you heard God right at all. But that's okay, because the journey of faith isn't powered by your certainty. It's powered by your trust. Trust that even when you can't see the way forward, you are not walking alone. Trust that even when the road is rough, His hand is steady. Trust that even when you fail, His promise stands. I will be with you. And when you begin to believe that, deeply, truly, quietly, you realize something sacred. You were never expected to carry the calling by yourself. You were never asked to be the hero. You were simply invited to walk with the one who already knows the way. So breathe. You don't have to know how it all works out. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to keep walking. One step, one moment, one breath, with Him. Because the fire that once spoke to Moses still burns. The voice that once called out from the bush still speaks. And the God who said, I will be with you then, says it still. To you, right now. Exactly as you are. The bush still burns. Maybe not in the same form, not as a literal flame in a desert, not as a supernatural fire on a lonely mountain, but the presence, the mystery, the voice. It still speaks. The fire still flickers in the corners of our lives, quiet and unnoticed by most, but unmistakable to those who are willing to turn aside and look. The modern world doesn't make it easy to notice burning bushes. We are surrounded by noise, distractions, demands. Our attention is constantly pulled from one screen to another, from one obligation to the next. And somewhere in the whirlwind of daily life, the sacred becomes silent, not because it has ceased to speak, but because we've forgotten how to listen. But the bush still burns. It burns in those strange, unexplainable moments when something stops you in your tracks. A sentence in a book, a line in a song, a look from a stranger, and suddenly something deeper awakens within you. You feel seen. You feel stirred. You feel called. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but with that unmistakable nudge that something holy is happening here, even if you don't fully understand it. The burning bush appears in moments that look ordinary, but are quietly drenched in grace. A friend calls at the exact moment you were falling apart. A prayer is answered in the form of a door you never thought would open. A long-forgotten memory surfaces, not to haunt you, but to heal you. These are not coincidences. These are not random. These are embers glowing with the presence of God. And just like Moses, we have a choice. We can keep walking. We can stay busy. We can ignore the strange fire that doesn't fit our plans. Or we can stop, turn aside, and say, "Here I am." That is always the invitation, not to achieve, not to impress, just to notice, to make space for the sacred, to realize that God still meets us in the wilderness of our lives, at the bus stop, in the grocery store, in the lonely silence of early morning, or the final minutes before sleep. The fire is not always loud, it's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just the overwhelming sense that you are not alone, that your life still has meaning, that love is still possible. that grace has not run out. The bush still burns in the lives of those we least expect. The homeless man who smiles with kindness deeper than gold. The single mother who carries impossible weight but still sings to her children at night. The elderly woman praying in a quiet church, unseen by the world but known deeply by heaven. These lives, ordinary on the outside, are burning bushes, signs of the divine alive and moving in a broken world. And maybe, so are you. Maybe you felt that flicker inside you, a restlessness, a quiet longing, a pull towards something more. Maybe it's been growing for years, hidden beneath layers of routine and responsibility. But it's there. A spark. A whisper. The same presence that spoke to Moses still speaks to you. Not because you are perfect, but because you are chosen. Not because you're ready, but because you're willing to look. The bush still burns in your questions, in your wondering about purpose, in your wrestling with faith, in your desire to be more than what the world says you are. It burns when you cry out to God in the dark and receive no immediate answer, only the strange, sacred peace that you are not unheard. It burns when you forgive someone you thought you never could. It burns when you choose love over bitterness, when you offer kindness that costs you something, when you pray even though you don't feel like it. The fire is alive in these things. It always has been. But here's the mystery. The bush burned, but it was not consumed. And perhaps that is the symbol God wants to give your heart. Because maybe you feel tired. Maybe life has felt like a fire, burning you down, wearing you out, testing your limits. But there is a flame that does not consume, a flame that purifies without destroying, a flame that calls without crushing. That is the presence of God. It does not demand that you have everything figured out. It simply asks that you look, that you turn aside, that you dare to believe that something holy is calling your name, even now, even here, even after everything you've been through. The fire has not gone out. The voice has not grown silent. The invitation still stands. And it may not come with thunder or lightning. It may come softly, through beauty, through sorrow, through a quiet knowing deep within. But it will come. So the next time you feel something stir inside you, something you can't quite name, don't brush it away. It might be the fire. It might be the voice. It might be the God of your ancestors, of your wilderness, of your calling. Still speaking, still burning, still inviting you to remove your sandals and draw near. Because the bush still burns. And the holy ground? It's wherever you dare to listen. There comes a moment, after the fire, after the fear, after the wrestling with doubt, when the soul must simply rest, not in answers, not in clarity, not in control, but in the presence of God. The burning bush wasn't just a call to action, it was a revelation of presence. It wasn't just about what Moses was supposed to do, it was about who was with him. The voice from the fire said, "I am who I am." Not, "I was," not, "I will be," but, "I am." Timeless, present, ever near. To rest in the voice of God means to rest in now. Not in the memory of how things used to be, not in the fantasy of how you hope things will turn out, but here, in this breath, in this moment. Because the voice of God does not always thunder from the heavens. More often, it hums gently in the silence. It is not always a directive. It is sometimes just a stillness that fills the heart and settles the soul. And when you come to trust that voice, even when it says little, you discover a peace that doesn't need proof. Think of Moses again. After the burning bush, his life didn't suddenly become easier. In fact, it became harder. He faced Pharaoh, faced rejection, led a people who often doubted him, wandered through deserts with little more than trust to guide him. But he had something far greater than a detailed map. He had presence. He had the assurance that God was with him, not just at the beginning, but every step of the way. That presence is available to you too. You may not see a pillar of fire in front of you. You may not hear a booming voice, but the same God who spoke to Moses in the wilderness is speaking now, in gentler ways, perhaps, but with just as much love. Maybe he speaks in the warmth of sunlight through your window, maybe in the words of a quiet friend, maybe in the peace that fills your heart when you finally let go of trying to do it all on your own. And that's what true rest in God looks like. It isn't about escaping the world. It's about carrying peace into it. It isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing God is near. It isn't about being fearless. It's about knowing that your fears don't have the final word. In a world that runs on noise, performance, and urgency, resting in God's voice feels radical. It means slowing down when everything says to hurry up. It means listening instead of reacting. It means praying not always with words, but with presence, with stillness, with faith that says, even if I don't hear him loudly, I trust he's here. The Hebrew word for spirit is ruach. It means breath, wind. That's how close God is. Not far off in the sky, but as close as your next breath. So to rest in God's voice is, in a way, to breathe with him, to inhale peace, to exhale fear, to sit in the sacred rhythm of being loved, not for what you do, but for who you are. When Moses later climbed Mount Sinai to receive the commandments, it wasn't the fire or the smoke that gave him strength. It was the time he spent in God's presence. So much so that when he came down, his face glowed. He had been changed not just by what he heard, but by who he had been with. That's what rest in God does. It transforms. It realigns. It reminds you that you are not alone, not in your calling, not in your pain, not in your waiting. And maybe that's what your soul has been longing for all along. Not more advice, not more doing, but more being, more resting, more sitting in the quiet, and letting yourself be loved by a God who sees, who knows, who stays. So right now, take a breath. Let your shoulders relax. Let your thoughts slow down. You don't have to figure it all out. You don't have to have the perfect words. You just have to be here, on holy ground, in the presence of a God who still speaks, and whose voice, even when silent, says, "You are mine, you are loved, I am with you," and that is enough.